Hello, it's Professor Swanson, and welcome to today's Biocast. Today we're going to be talking about cellular respiration. Now, when we're going to be talking about respiration today, we're not going to be talking about the type of respiration you probably typically think of, which is breathing in and out. Breathing is a part of cellular respiration because it provides us with the oxygen we need in order to have cellular respiration occur. But what we are talking about in cellular respiration is actually the production of energy. Now, we've talked a little bit about solar energy already and how they convert solar energy into chemical energy. Now, what we're going to talk about here is taking and converting the chemical energy into the energy that we can use on a daily basis. Typically, when you think about energy use and energetic activities, you're probably thinking about things such as this: running, movement, lifting weights, or doing work. But we're not really concerned with this level of energy. We're concerned in this topic with energy at the cellular level. Now, it's true that all of the activities that you see, running, working, moving, all of that, is just the culmination of lots of different cellular activities. So in reality, the activities that you see here between the chicken and the race, it is cellular activity as well and requires cellular energy, even though we don't often think of it that way. In order for your cells to use energy, it has to be in some form that it can convert from the chemical energy into other types of energy that it's going to need for the functions of the cell. And the molecule that we end up using is called ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, shown here. We use ATP to move energy around in a cell because it contains a lot of potential energy. What you'll see is we have 3 phosphate groups attached to each other on the tail end of the ATP. And each one of those phosphate groups has a negative oxygen attached to it. Now, since like charges repel, there's a lot of repulsive activity going on between each of these oxygen atoms here. With all of that repulsive energy, then, the bonds connecting these phosphate groups together have to be incredibly strong. So these bonds contain a lot of potential energy. Now, adenosine triphosphate from animals is going to be produced in the mitochondria that we see here. The mitochondria is similar to the chloroplast in that it has a 2-membrane system, an outer membrane and an inner membrane. And you can see outer membrane running along the outside, and then we can see a whole series of inner membranes running throughout the mitochondria. This should remind you of the chloroplast then as well. Now, where do animals get the energy that they're going to need to make ATP so that they can use it for their daily activities? If you're an herbivore like the prairie dog we see here, you'll get your energy from the plants that you end up eating, from the sugars that the plants have produced through photosynthesis. In contrast, if you're a carnivore like the stomias, deep sea fish that we see here, you'll be obtaining your energy from eating other animals and taking the sugars that they have in their body. So this leads us to a question. Do plants need cellular respiration? Since they are already producing energy and ATP from photosynthesis, do they need to worry about going through cellular respiration? Or alternatively, do plants have mitochondria? Well, if we take a look at a plant cell, you can see that here is our chloroplast. Hopefully you remember the shape of that. And so they do have the chloroplast, but over here, you'll also see that they have mitochondria. So the plants do undergo cellular respiration because they still need that energy. The chloroplasts in the process of photosynthesis, if you remember, was really about making sugars. Then the plants are going to still utilize those sugars as well and break them down through the process of cellular respiration. So this is a stylized version of a mitochondria. We have our outer membrane shown here in blue. Then we cut away a portion of that outer membrane to get a clearer view of our inner membrane here shown in brown. Cellular respiration is broken up into 3 major components, and we're going to take a look at each one of those components for a minute here. You notice that we have our mitochondria drawn up here just to show us where the different parts of the reactions are going to be taking place. So we're going to take the blue line here, and this is going to represent the outer membrane of the mitochondria. We're going to put another brown membrane in here, and that's going to represent our inner mitochondrial membrane so that we can see what's happening where. Now, the first stage that we have is glycolysis. And glycolysis, as its name should give you a clue, deals with glucose, and it lyses it. It breaks it down, so it's glycolysis. And that's going to be happening outside of the mitochondria in the cytoplasm of the cell. Following glycolysis, there's another stage of preparatory reactions, which will produce some intermediates we need. Then inside the matrix of the mitochondria, we're going to have the Krebs cycle occurring. And then in the intermembrane space, the area here between our two membranes, we're going to have electron transfer, phosphorylation. What we'll do now is to take a look at each one of these sets of reactions in a little more detail and see what reactants are going into it and the products that come out of it and how those will be incorporated later on. The first process that we're going to look at in a little more detail is glycolysis. The first process we're going to look at in a little more detail is glycolysis, whereby we're going to break down a glucose molecule into two smaller molecules. And this is going to be taking place in the cytoplasm of the cell, not actually in the mitochondria itself. The bonds holding together the atoms of the glucose molecule are held together pretty tightly. They're pretty strong bonds. So we're going to have to take some energy to actually break those bonds apart. So we're going to need to input 2 ATP into the process to break down our glucose molecule. Now, as we go through and do that, we will end up with 2 pyruvate molecules. And we're going to end up sending those pyruvate molecules into the next process. During the process of glycolysis, we will also generate energy and will generate 4 ATP through the process. But since we used 2 ATP to break apart our glucose molecules, that means we're going to end up netting only 2 ATP from the process. Additionally, though, we're also going to produce 2 electron transport molecules of NADH. And that's the major process of what happens in glycolysis. Our next step in cellular respiration are the preparatory reactions, which are going to produce some of the molecules that we're going to need in the Krebs cycle. The 2 pyruvate molecules which we produced in glycolysis are going to enter into the mitochondria this time, into the matrix area, up in this region, and they are going to be broken down further into 2 molecules of acetyl coenzyme A. In addition, the preparatory reactions will also end up producing 2 molecules of NADH, the electron carrier molecules. The acetyl coenzyme A molecules will be transported into the Krebs cycle, and the 2 NADH molecules will be used to help drive the electron transport chain and create our proton gradient that we're going to need in electron transfer phosphorylation. The next stage in cellular respiration, which we're going to look at, is the Krebs cycle. Now, the Krebs cycle is going to be taking place in the matrix of our mitochondria again, and we're going to be bringing in the acetyl coenzyme A that we just produced in the preparatory reactions, and that's going to be our starting point for driving the Krebs cycle. And as we make our turns through the Krebs cycle, we'll produce 2 ATP, which we'll be able to use for energy. And we will also produce 6 CO2 molecules as waste products. And these will be shipped outside of the mitochondria and eventually be expelled as waste products. Now, the major purpose of the Krebs cycle is to produce electron transport molecules of NADH and FADH2. Now, for each glucose molecule, we're going to get 2 pyruvate molecules, and we're going to get 2 acetyl coenzyme A molecules, which means we'll get 2 full turns of the Krebs cycle. 1, 2. So we get 1 ATP out of that first turn. We get a second ATP out of the second turn. We get 3 carbon dioxides out of the first turn, 3 carbon dioxides out of the second turn, and we'll get 4 NADH molecules out of the first turn and 4 out of the second turn. So we end up with 8 NADH molecules. The first turn will produce 1 FADH2 molecule. The second turn will produce another FADH molecule. So we'll have 2 FADH2 molecules, which we are then going to send into our third and final step, electron transfer phosphorylation. Now we're going to look at the third and final stage in cellular respiration, electron transfer phosphorylation. This is going to occur in the matrix of the mitochondria, but it's also going to be occurring in the intermembrane spaces. And to show that, I've tried to recreate those again here. We have our blue membrane here, which is our outer membrane, and our brownish membrane here, which is our inner membrane. Now, in electron transfer phosphorylation, what we're going to do is we're going to bring in the electron transport molecules that we created in the Krebs cycle, our 8 NADH and 2 FADH2 molecules, and we are going to reduce those to becoming NAD plus and FAD. Now, when we reduce these, those are going to free up electrons and protons. The electrons are going to go through the electron transport chain, and they're going to use the energy that we generate from the electron transport chain to drive the protons through the inner membrane into the intermembrane space, where we're going to create a proton gradient so that we have many more protons in the inner membrane space than we do inside the matrix here. This should be very similar to what you remember from photosynthesis. Now, the last thing we need to do is figure out what we're going to do with the electrons that we have running through our electron transfer chain and the protons that we have now between the inner membrane and the outer membrane of the mitochondria. Why we actually breathe actually has to do with trying to get rid of those electrons. We need to have a terminal electron receptor, and that's what our oxygen is going to do. So our breathing in oxygen is really a way for us to get rid of the electrons as they run through the electron transport chain. And we end up producing a waste product of this for water. Now, what we're going to need to do still, though, is if we want to make water, we need to get the oxygens broken apart, and we're going to need to combine those with those hydrogens that we have in the intermembrane space. So we need to get a system that's going to allow us to bring our hydrogen ions back into the matrix of the mitochondria. And we're going to do that through ATP synthase. And as our hydrogen ions flow through the ATP synthase, we'll be generating energy, which will allow us to produce our jackpot of 32 ATP. Great, you guys have just finished cellular respiration and the 3 major parts of it. Now, let's give ourselves a quick quiz and see if we can figure out how much of it we remember. What's the first stage that we have in cellular respiration? You should have said glycolysis. Following glycolysis, we have the preparatory reactions. Now, the preparatory reactions are going to produce molecules that we need for the Krebs cycle, And then the third and final stage that we really have for cellular respiration is going to be electron transfer phosphorylation. Now what we'd like to do is let's see if we can remember which of these reactions occurs where. If we were to draw a line showing the outer membrane of the mitochondria, where would it go? Hopefully you realize that it goes between glycolysis and all the rest of it. The preparatory reactions, the Krebs cycle, and electron transfer phosphorylation all occur within the mitochondria. The last thing we want to do is think about how much energy can we generate from all of these reactions. If we remember, in glycolysis, we generate 4 ATP. However, we had to use 2 ATP in the process of glycolysis, so that means that we end up with a net of only 2 ATP from glycolysis. The Krebs cycle ends up producing 2 ATP. It also ends up producing 6 CO2 molecules, though. That's what we exhale. That's part of our waste products. And then lastly, the electron transfer phosphorylation. Remember, that's the big jackpot. That ends up producing 32 ATP molecules. This results between all three processes then in a net total of 32 plus 2 plus 2, 36 ATP molecules created for every molecule of glucose that we end up burning. And this is the energy that we're going to use to drive all of our cellular reactions that we need, and is really the source of energy that you use to keep yourself alive. So I hope that helps you understand cellular respiration, and we'll chat with you soon on another Biocast.